Hello there, you are listening to The Screen Queen, where you'll be finding your favorite movie or your favorite television show and learning something new. You'll just have to listen to find out. Here is your host, Samantha Parrish. So I turn 30 next month, and I find it incredibly ironic that this is the episode that is pretty much going to send me into my 30s by looking over something that's pretty much been around as long as I've been alive. CSI existed in the new wave of television. This became a piece of television that paved the way for many TV shows, many careers, many ideas that we wouldn't have if CSI wasn't the next one to put their hat in the ring and do something else for the procedural genre. It created a microscope to look into what it's like to see a case being solved. CSI Miami, and CSI New York became one of the first batch of procedurals where you got to marry a story with the science. But now, these years later, people are looking at the show and they're separating the science from the story, and now it's being judged if its forensics are as fictional as its show. So for this episode, I'm going to focus on just Las Vegas, Miami, and New York. As much as I said it's a franchise, this is what is usually known as the franchise. So it goes without saying, this is going to be a massive episode. As of the time I'm recording this, I don't even know how much of a massive episode this is going to be. I have recorded it before, and man, I found things I didn't even know I had. All of my CSI roots were definitely showing more than I thought when I originally wrote this episode. So in this episode, I'll be discussing how it's aged, taking the shows individually, and then putting them all together in the end. You know, like a case. So for the first franchise special, this is the CSI series. So what technically is the birth of CSI? When people think of CSI, usually it's Grissom's face or Horatio Caine, but no. It's actually a man named Anthony E. Zuiker, who is a name that you have probably seen. If you've seen CSI a multitude of times, that's got to be a name that pops up without fail. This man was working the tram tracks in Vegas when he wrote a screenplay that would go down in television history. And he was 29 years old when he pitched the idea to CBS about doing a science procedural drama. And CBS was like, sure, let's do it. And he's like, great. But there had to be a backup, because when you see Anthony E. Zuiker, you also see Jerry Bruckheimer. And I'm sure a lot of my screen team knows that name, since that's the name responsible for getting Michael Bay a paycheck every time. But he's got some very phenomenal films under his belt with his production, between Jacob's Ladder, Flashdance, and then my first R-rated film ever, Fatal Attraction. After the premiere of CSI in 2000, Anthony E. Zuiker was greenlit for another show, CSI Miami, in 2002, and then CSI New York in 2004. So here's the runtime. CSI ran from 2000 to 2015. CSI Miami ran from 2002 to 2012. And CSI New York ran from 2004 to 2013. Looking at that and having to think of them as 3 shows in one, that's 15 years of CSI. Well, at least until that revival came along. But looking at this sole 15 years is what we're working with, because this is really where the heart of the history is for CSI. I don't hear too many people talking about CSI these days. This was a show around for 15 years, additionally with 2 shows for 10 years each. It's kind of strange how something that was everywhere seemed to just be nowhere. Whenever I talk about CSI, I only hear that Miami is mentioned above all of them. So now that I've set the stage for how the evidence is here, let's go into the evidence, starting with CSI. When CSI came out in 2000, we got to know the crew of the night shift with Gil Grissom, Catherine Willows, Warwick Brown, Nick Stokes, eventually future CSI Greg Sanders, badass babe Sarah Seidel, and my favorite, Captain Jim Brass, who I may or may not get emotional talking about in this episode, but who Everyone knows I'm no stranger to getting emotional about characters. It's what I do. Looking at the pilot of CSI, it doesn't exactly match the story of CSI. Everything that exists within the pilot exists just within the pilot. It starts out with the usual team, but there was an additional character named Holly Gribbs. Now, originally, Holly was written as a main character. They had her established as a main character, but her ass did not appear in the second episode. Unfortunately, in the test screenings for the pilot, there was a negative reception to the character of Holly. So, at the very last minute, they wrote in a segment to have Captain Jim Brass come in and be like, Holly Gribbs has been shot. She's in critical condition. She's not going to make it. And I was like, whoa. That was fast. But the way that it plays out, it does feel like it could happen anytime. So in a way, Holly's exit, it felt accurate, even though it didn't work out for the actress who played Holly. But this also led to the addition of Sarah Seidel. As much as it would have been nice to see what Holly would have looked like, there is no CSI without Sarah, like there is no CSI without Grissom. Like, when you get involved with these characters, they are your characters. There's almost a selfishness that a fan gets with these characters for how integrated. And when some of these characters have left the show, it kind of feels like you're saying goodbye to an old friend and you have no idea when you're going to see them again. And you're just immediately getting into their cases and getting into their lives, like you're right there along with them. When I talked to some of my friends about CSI, especially after Grissom's departure, a majority of them said, no, it's not my CSI because it doesn't have Grissom. And it's very understandable. When you are starting with these people, it feels weird to not end with some of the same people. The entire first season of CSI, it's peak television. When I said this was like the new wave of television, I really felt this was the new wave of television. In a way, it doesn't feel dated. It just feels like getting to see what that transition looked like. Now that technically CSI is considered nostalgia, and I remember what that type of media looked like back then, oh god, that hurts to say. But in the first season, there's an unspoken way that the show was able to highlight the disabled community. On the show, there began to be more changes, because I said that eventually a character named Greg Sanders comes through, and at the same time, they finally got sold on a regular coroner character named Albert, played by Robert David Hall. Now, Robert David Hall unfortunately had a car accident in the 80s, making him a double amputee. And that hurt him immensely as an actor, not being able to find roles that will accommodate him. And he's become an advocate for the disability community, as well as represent them for actors that also have disabilities of all kinds. The role of the coroner was written specifically for him, making an awareness to people that have to live without certain limbs. Of all the things on CSI, this is the one part that I'm very surprised doesn't get talked about enough, and I'm glad that it exists. But also, too, I have to add that Robert David Hall is also a musician, so he got to show off his musical chops in this, and it is not disappointing. But speaking more on the representation, that is kind of what also made CSI great, is how they represented other things. When you go through the first 5 or 6 seasons, you see the most far-fetched plots involving things with dwarves or like big women conventions, age play. There was a lot of stuff that they just threw onto there. And in a day and age like that, where most of those topics are either talked about with respect or they're talked about in a different sense, it's kind of like an interesting time capsule that CSI got to be one of the few ways to first start talking about that and start depicting things that you wouldn't normally see on television because it was either taboo or just wasn't respected. One of the examples is an episode, Fur and Loathing, that I saw before doing this episode, and I had to find a way to talk about it on here because that episode was made because Anthony E. Zuiker's son is a furry. I would have never known that the furry episode was made because of that. I thought it was just, oh, it's out there like the rest of the show, but no. This man accepted his son for what he wanted to do in the furry community and then made an episode to highlight a little bit more about it. It goes into the many compliments for the show about how it's inclusive and respectful and quirky and informative. It just builds charm after charm after charm in the many episodes that you get that makes it age so well today. So now's a good time as any to talk about the characters of CSI, which is the part I have been dying to do. So let's start with, the man, the myth, the bug lover, Gil Grissom. Gil Grissom is not your traditional procedural leader. Usually when you look at a lot of shows like Law & Order or Miami Vice, it's usually very machismo dudes or confident dudes. And Grissom's the very definition of brains over brawn, but you can tell his brawn is his brains. He's a nerd, he talks like a nerd, he acts like a nerd, he's a nerd. But he's a heroic nerd, and that's kind of the best way I can sum up his character. Because he's so smart, he knows how to handle intense situations. He's passive even in the most intense situations. He maintains a chill morale, making him the perfect leader to know he is going to keep this team safe and he's going to get the answers. William Peterson, who also produces the show, so he became the third important part of how CSI came to life, but William Peterson really did take on a lot of what it means to be Gil Grissom and understanding the science of what Gil Grissom has to do. William Peterson did go testify in court on behalf of crime labs to get the much needed equipment to solve these cases. When he put together that this is how the science work and that science is not always accessible, that's someone who uses their power right, and I love it. So I'm going to put a little pause on Grissom because he's still going to be praised throughout this episode, and I'm going to sprinkle that into my other evidence. He's an important piece. Anyway, the other amazing character among the amazing characters is Catherine Willows. Now, this is a lesser known fact, but it was damn hard to get women into a procedural setting. Nowadays, can you imagine Law & Order Special Victims Unit without Olivia Benson? Well, it took years to get there. Back in Law & Order, there had to be more female representation. And then 10 years later, we get probably what is the best female representation of Catherine Willows that just basically got everything going. The ladies in Law & Order walked so Catherine Willows could run. Let's just say that. The character of Catherine Willows is the epitome of what female authority looks like without having to have a drop of sexism involved with it. Whenever a woman is taken seriously, she's usually seen as a take-no-shit person. And you kind of have to have that regardless of your gender, and the way that she works so well with Grissom, that they have a perfect female and male dynamic, that she shines more and he doesn't outdo her shine because they're both there to get the cases done. And she can get her work done with the way that she is respected. And she earned that respect. The backstory of Catherine is very inspiring, that she was an exotic dancer that was given a chance to show her smarts, and someone went on a limb for her and took her under his wing, and she eventually got to be a qualified investigator and eventually work along the big dogs in the Las Vegas unit. And that part of her life is brought up a lot. But it's the way that she doesn't have to take an explanation for her life, because she doesn't owe people an explanation, but they're not going to let her be used. It is the most beautiful way I've ever seen how that works with a woman in the workforce to handle stuff like that. Catherine really paves the way that anybody can do it. She's like the blonde Rosie the Riveter. But she never forgot her roots about what it was like to be in that life, which made her have so much more empathy when she can say, listen, I've been in your shoes. They do hurt, and I want to help you. It's just one of the amazing things about her character is that she's willing to make someone understand without them being unheard. She hears just as well as Grissom does, but she doesn't speak in science, even though, yes, she does, because the woman is wicked smart. But then there's the other beautiful female character, and that is the woman who won Gil Grissom's heart, Sarah Seidel. So Sarah came in after Holly unfortunately had to depart, and Sarah is one of the most intense characters on CSI. She is someone that will get the job done, but doesn't know when the job is done. For someone as smart as her that can dance around Grissom in the way that he has his Grissom-isms and how she solves her own cases, Sarah herself is a bit of a difficult case where she is kind of her own worst enemy. But unfortunately, I don't think Sarah had the best justice to her character. When Sarah first departed CSI around season 8, it felt like you were saying goodbye to an old friend. And like I said, these characters, you get selfishly invested into them, and Sarah is someone that you watched fall down and get back up, and she finally knew when it was time to throw in the towel. And it felt appropriate. Having this character for 8 years, you felt like, okay, girl, I get it. Time to move on. You had your time here. Thanks for the memories. But then in season 10, they just brought her back, and it didn't feel as welcoming as it should have been. When her goodbye letter was there, I felt it the way everyone else did when she departed. But when she came back for season 10, that she decided to come back to CSI just because. And making it that way, it didn't really help. Now, Sarah was actually brought back on because the character Riley just didn't make the cut for the whole year, and they had to cut her out, but they had to bring someone else in, and they were like, hey, why don't we bring Sarah back? Again. So now she was the replacement for Holly, and now it just looks like she was the replacement for Riley. It just seems like Sarah is supposed to be a permanent replacement character. Now, that's not what the intentions were, but that's what it looks like. Because when she stays on, it kind of gets rid of the whole point of what happened when she left CSI, when she got together, whether with Grissom, when she got together with Grissom, and then they got married and life's great, and it's like, you want them to be together, and now it's just her and not Grissom. It's like, I needed them to have their happy ending, and now she's just back where she started, and it felt like it didn't really do the best justice to a character that sought out justice. But the next character I'm talking about, tragic just seems to be the only way I can sum up who Warwick Brown is. So Warwick is introduced as a character with a gambling addiction, and it's still a reoccurring part of the show. But even though he's a tragic character that has the worst problems in his life, and even shit he never asked for, he is so brilliant. The way I love about CSI is how you can trust these characters to solve a case. This is a character that has gambling addiction issues, but I have no doubt in my mind he's going to solve the case. Warwick has been given many chances in this show, and he does not squander what those chances do for him and the people that believe in him. But there is also a tragedy that I found out with the actor that plays Warwick Brown that it's made me appreciate his character so much more. When Gary Dordan was about 2 years old, his family went on vacation, and his big brother, Daryl Dordan, was shoved off a cliff and fell straight to his death. I mean, there's no other outcome except on that, unfortunately, but it is still an unsolved case. So for Gary Dordan to have to play an investigator that gets answers every day despite having one major part of his life that will never be answered, it's a heavy thing, and it's made me appreciate his character so much more. It's not the first time that I've heard about an actor that had a tragedy that went unsolved and then they go on to play an investigator, and that they still give this kind of respect the way that they have been having to cope with it and what they needed to hear. But there's actually a big misconception as to why Gary Dordan left the show. And since I do appreciate his character so much, I want to bring more of that up for a spotlight in case that comes up into a controversy again. So Gary Dordan unfortunately had a lot of legal issues going on during his time on CSI, and right around season 9, his character was killed off, and many people thought, oh, well, they killed him off because of his legal issues. Actually, no. He just chose to not go back onto the show, and it just happened to be that the legal issues came right after he made that decision. So he was already not going to come back by his own choice. So I'm going to try and do a speed run for the next couple of characters because I had forgotten how many people became future characters on this show, and we got at least 2 more shows to go through, so let's do this. Next up is Greg Sanders. I love his character. I love the fact that he's a comedic relief, but my goodness, you're never going to find more of a pinnacle of the 2000s than Greg Sanders. Every season when he changes his hairstyle, I can immediately know what year that we're in. If there's ever a way that has made me feel old, this was what clicked to me at 28 years old, that, oh my god, this is starting to feel dated. Like, I felt it in my soul. I love that he starts out to be this plucky guy that does so many funny things, and he adds a much needed amount of humor to some of the horrific things that you get in the first couple of seasons of CSI. I have never had a moment that I did not laugh at his character. Eric Smanda played him to perfection to give us a much needed laugh on the show. But when his character matured, holy shit, you really felt it, because Greg worked his ass off to go from being a lab tuck and then going straight into being a CSI. He still has his quips and stuff here and there, but I've never seen a slow burn maturity like Greg, because we all know maturity does not happen overnight. There had to be multiple things that happened to Greg to cultivate him into the CSI that we know and trust, just like Grissom or Catherine. If there's ever a situation that Greg has to be in charge of everything, we can trust Greg. And then my favorite Texan character, Nick Stokes. So, Nick's a bit of a hardball character in the sense that it's hard to get anything out of him sometimes. All the characters have been established in a certain trait that you can get behind, like if they're going through something, like Grissom has a hearing problem, Catherine's going through a divorce, Warwick has a gambling addiction, Sarah can't cut off. Nick is Texan and sweet, but in a way that kind of made him stand out as a character that you got to know from the first day. But just like Greg, Nick had to go through some maturing too. In the first season, he was still a little wet behind the ears, but Nick's a character that's very quick to correct himself. He doesn't have to have someone tell him that he's full of shit. He's like, oh shit, that's me, I got it. And that does help out in situations when you know that Nick is going through something intense. And let me just say, Nick has gone through some shit more than any other characters. If anyone else has to say, never have I ever been in a glass box, Nick would win that hands down. After the ordeals that he faced in the first season when he had to walk away from having a gun in his face, in these intense moments, Nick goes back and forth from civility to authority, but you never know which one is going to come up for grabs because we never know what's going to happen when it does. There's that rawness to Nick that you're still seeing someone that you can believe in him, but you still fear for him. But in a way that just makes the show still seem more humane, that these are people that can save the day, but there's no one there to save them. They unfortunately take a risk factor with this job, with putting their lives in the line, and they have to walk away and not feel unscathed. And I think Nick is a good example of what that looks like. Okay, and then we save the best for last. My favorite part. My favorite character. Captain Jim Brass. I have never seen a more sassier character than Captain Jim Brass. It's often why I call him Captain Sass. In a way, Captain Brass reminds me a little bit of the police chief from Freakazoid that has like that deadpan humor, just immediately saying it like he means it, just calling it out, making that joke, doing that pun. Oh my goodness. He is one of the funnier parts that just has a beautiful delivery every time. But the thing about his character is that he is the man that gets the shit done. Sometimes it can almost feel paint by numbers when you put like an old man in the position of police chief, but oh no, like I pray for the lives that Captain Brass has to threaten in order to get some cases solved. If there is ever a character that you need someone to butt heads with somebody else, he is the perfect person to butt heads with somebody else and win. He is a character that does not tolerate bullshit of any sense, and it does help the job get infinitesimally faster for Grissom and the team to be able to get everything done. He is the most integral part that pushes the investigation in crime scene investigations. He is a bold and old brawn to the brain of the group. But Captain Brass also has the biggest honor for being a part of the first time that CSI ever got the highest Nielsen ratings. So of all the episodes that has existed in 15 years, the first taste of success that the show ever had, and it's about Captain Brass's estranged daughter. Ellie marked the first time that CSI had ever gotten #1 in the highest Nielsen ratings, which back then, in the world of television, that's the greatest honor. On streaming, that doesn't mean too much today, but for a show riding the new wave and having the first episode have the highest ratings about Captain Brass's daughter, it kind of comes out of nowhere, but usually the best stories are the ones that you would never expect. Now, honestly, I could go on more about the episodes, but I feel like the whole show itself almost seems to be a favorite episode. When I was going through Paramount Plus and I was reading through a lot of the episodes to find which ones I wanted to talk about, I found that Anthony E. Zwicker has a lot more favorites than I did when I first scoured through the shows. There's at least a handful per season that he has made a introduction about, with a process for a specific episode you would never think has a certain detail to it, but since this is a show about investigations and evidence, well, I feel like that just kind of fit the roster. But then there was the time that Quentin Tarantino directed an episode of CSI. I had no easy segue for that, but that is the most surprising thing that I have told people about CSI, is the time Quentin Tarantino decided to make an amazing 2-parter episode that is unbelievably amazing. Just after Kill Bill, Anthony E. Zwicker and Quentin Tarantino were chatting after a UFC match. And they were going back and forth about their stories, because at the time, they were basically the hot commodities of the early 2000s with having CSI and the guy that made Kill Bill, and decided, hey, let's do an episode. And so Quentin Tarantino got to Tarantino-ize CSI for a little bit. The 2-parter episode, Grave Danger, is, I'm just going to say it, one of the most cinematic moments of this show. As much as they do have great effects, and I love the way they literally bring a case to life, that you're putting the pieces together in these unique, effective ways, but having Quentin Tarantino bring his type of R-rated material into a show that also kind of teeter-tottered a little bit about testing the edge of what can be on television, because back then, you did not have what you have today. There was not a lot of violence, there was not a lot of nudity, and CSI during the time actually tested those and had nudity on one of their episodes, despite not being approved to always have nudity, and not always approved to have a lot of violent moments. So Tarantino coming on felt like a unique way to still explore how they teeter-tottered on that line, and damn did it pay off. So the 2-parter of this plot is where poor Nick Stokes gets ensnared and trapped in a box in the ground, and CSI now has to bust against time to find out who kidnapped Nick and can they save Nick in time before anything else happens. And it's the first time that all the CSIs are stumped. They had someone that was just dangling a string in front of them the whole time. They felt absolutely helpless. Seeing the look on Grissom's face when he sees Nick in the box, that's a rare face for the leader to have. You know you're in deep shit when Grissom is like, oh, fuck. But the episode is very Tarantino. In the very beginning of the episode, when Nick and Warwick are having a chat. Warwick has Tarantino dialogue. I have literally sat with that character for many seasons, but I can automatically tell that he's talking Tarantino. And it's not bad. Honestly, if you have to make a Tarantino episode, I would expect to hear Tarantino dialogue. I mean, I've basically had to accept that by now. He's someone that I do like as a director, but I can also see why people criticize him and they're not the biggest fan of him. And it is pretty cool to hear Warwick speak like a Tarantino character. But there's also been some talk that this feels more like a TV movie. Even though this is a part of season 5, this has also been separated to just be called the CSI movie Grave Danger. In other countries, they're like, let's just go ahead and make this just a movie and send it out than having it a part of a season. It's very weird, but it's not the first time that CSI has been differed in different countries. But I also found out that this story does depict something from reality. Now, looking at the plot, it smells like this is just the CSI doing Kill Bill, but it is based off of a case. In 1968, there was a kidnapping and live burial of Barbara Jane Mackle. She was placed in a specialized ventilated coffin while being held for ransom. So this is where it stops being like Kill Bill, but I get it. When you're known for the guy who put the bride in the box, it does feel like that would feel it's taken from that. But that's the true story behind where Grave Danger came from. But this episode also does a great job at highlighting previous episodes. We've gotten to know these characters, but we've also gotten to know their foes. And it does a good job doing some cliff notes for previous cases, because if someone's being threatened, you'd have to recall all of that material to see if anyone else is gonna somehow magically have a revenge appearance. They name drop a couple of characters from past episodes that have been incarcerated or killed to wonder, could they have gotten Nick? These characters waste no time going through the past cases that they've closed to make sure that this isn't what led to Nick's kidnapping. There's a reference to another episode called Stalker, which was the other time Nick was in danger, and no one hesitated to be like, could it be that crazy guy that tried to kill Nick to be him? It's a great episode. If you're the biggest fan of CSI, but you want to know what is considered to be the greatest episode, and I can agree that it is the greatest episode, it is Grave Danger. So as we're winding down from talking about CSI, I think it's about time to talk about the change in CSI in season 9. So when people say that the show ended when Grissom left, personally, it ended when Warwick died. Even though I already mentioned that Gary Dordan left the show of his own choice and not because of the legal reasons, but when they killed off his character, it did feel like a wind down from the show. Even though Warwick's death did push these characters in a different stance to do what they would do if Warwick was still alive and they're moving on with their lives, but there's no Warwick. And after there was no Warwick, there was no Grissom. So you have two major characters that left in the same season. Of course, of their own choices, but still, it does change the way the charm goes from there. Season 9 felt like it was wrapping up everything. We had some past killers come back, like the miniature killer case that almost got Sarah unalived. Around episode 9 is where we had an introduction to Grissom's replacement, Dr. Langston. And I'm glad that there was like a nice, good introduction to bring in Dr. Langston so we weren't just thrown into it. It did feel like an appropriate send-off. It felt like the torch was being guided into a hand that we knew was going to do what Grissom did. We had to have someone that was just as nerdy as Grissom, but had just as much as authority as Grissom, and Dr. Langston fit the bill. Except here's the problem. Unfortunately, Dr. Langston isn't Grissom. Even though that's literally the point of why Grissom left, is that we have to have someone, but this was where fans were like, sorry, but CSI is Grissom, not this guy. And Lawrence Fishburne, bless him, he did a wonderful job. I have no problems with him, but I myself, I had a hard time tuning into CSI after work and Grissom left. Dr. Langston was a good addition because you have to have someone that you feel would meet the same criteria as Grissom, but it's not Grissom. Lawrence Fishburne did give it a solid performance. And he really did fit the shoes, but it's just not Grissom. But then when DB Sweeney came through, that's when it really started to feel that the gears were slowing down for CSI. At this point in season 12, when you have a third new main guy, when you didn't even have enough time with the second new main guy, like, the writing was on the wall. But I do have to say, when DB Sweeney's character came up, it did feel like the softest landing for the low blows of the show. It's not exactly Grissom, and it's not exactly Langston, but at least it was different enough just to ride it out the rest of the way. There were lists that came out around 2012 and 2013 about shows that needed to be canceled, and CSI was starting to pop up more for how much the show was getting stretched and people were tired of getting stretched. Around 2014, 2015, CSI started to pop up in many top 10 lists for shows that needed to be canceled or shows that lost their mojo, and unfortunately, they did take place in a lot of those lists. No, lists are kind of opinionated, but they're not wrong. I wasn't even paying attention at that point. Around the final years of CSI, the writing was on the wall, and it was already being written by the fans that had just said, you gotta close this case. So CSI wrapped up with a movie called Immortality, where it brought back everybody. You had Grissom and Sarah and DB and Catherine and everyone, even Lady Heather, who was one of the most unique side characters that had a handful of episodes that even she came back. This truly felt like the way it wrapped up, to go all the way to the beginning and give us everything that we've already known to be wrapped up in a little bow and sent off for 15 years of being on the air. But then in 2021, we had a little surprise from our favorite science guys. CSI came back as CSI Vegas, which, that's kind of the thing that people have been asking for years, like, why don't you call it CSI Las Vegas? And, well, I guess now it's happened. And we had the big dogs back. We had Grissom and Catherine and Sarah. Brass came back. He was blind, but he came back. Hodges came back. Greg came back. Everybody came back. Unfortunately, there's one thing, the show itself exactly didn't come back. Now, I gave CSI Vegas a shot for a handful of episodes just to see what they were doing, and it was a nice continuation. They gave us what we needed to see if these characters were to pick up where they left off on, and we were given a new team. And the new team, led by Paula Newsome and the rest of the cast, they did a good job being a standalone CSI crew that could mesh well with the current CSI crew. I liked Paula Newsome being the female front of CSI, because Lord knows it definitely can be proven that we can have a female face of CSI. So that was a lovely way to introduce things. And the plot still carried along with the original characters for whoever came back. And Grissom and Sarah. Hodges had a very weird, interesting plot line. But then it lost steam. Unfortunately, it shot itself in the foot without even trying to shoot itself in the foot, because it just felt like CSI all over again, and it fell into the same things like original CSI did, and procedurals around this point in time are starting to just be a dime a dozen, so they were reviving something that felt nostalgic for the moment, but then just fell into the fodder. CSI is great for its time. There's no way that we'd have some of the procedurals if this wasn't the one that made that leap from 90s television into the new era of television. And, as dated as it is, you can't quite forget your roots. That this show walked so the others could run. And then it had a sequel show that was way more popular than its predecessor. Now, allow me to tell you a little something about myself. CSI Miami is my gateway show that pretty much made me the person that loves procedural dramas. I was 12 years old when I got into the series, and I was known as the CSI kid in my middle school and I wore the shirts that said, I heard watching CSI Miami. Like, I was cringe, but I was proud cringe. Being interested into a show like CSI Miami that gave me like the first glimpse about science and investigations and how law and procedure work. And at that age, I had a very tough time grasping things in education. And this was the show that helped me in a big way to understand the world around me a little bit better. My mother had absolutely no complaints about her child getting into law procedural shows like she did, so she was good with it. And also it helped my grades better. If it wasn't for the show, I probably wouldn't have passed 7th and 8th grade history and science. During the time that CSI was venturing into season 3, they decided to bring on their first crossover that served as a pilot, where Catherine Willows was asked by Gil, and by asked, we mean ordered, to go to Miami and find a missing little girl and her mother. And that is when we meet Lieutenant Horatio Kane, who would go on to be the most divisive part and the most famous part of the show, and we'll get into that as time goes on. But for an introductory episode that serves as a crossover for both shows of CSI and CSI Miami, it's a stellar crossover. You were jumping in from Las Vegas, and you were jumping into Miami, and you knew that these are the same people that knew how to play the game just like Las Vegas. So the birth of CSI Miami, well, of course we already know who's in charge of it, Anthony E. Zuiker, but there was another source to this show that also has their tie-in with another Florida procedural show, Don Johnson, who played Sonny Crockett. Don Johnson he was the one that found most of the designs, helped cultivate most of the aesthetic for the show, to the point that the showrunners were like, hey, you've worked on this show so much and you played a Florida cop. How would you like to play Horatio Kane? And he was like, hard pass. He had already hung up his Miami Vice days and he was not interested in doing another one, but he did appreciate the offer. But looking at the pilot, comparing this to when I saw it at 12 years old and then seeing it as an adult after the show has had some time to go under a tighter microscope, you start to see some things. Now we're gonna go over the show that puts the E in CSI Miami. Okay, that's the best I got. All we needed was the yeah. Good. Okay, let's get on with it. Seeing the way Horatio Kane is presented as a character that you trust to save the day, just like you trusted Grissom to save the day in his own way, we had to have some way to get an intriguing and engaging presence, and having Horatio Kane as our introduction is a hell of a way to get hooked. And the rest of the team is pretty great, between Callie Duquesne and Tim Speedle, Eric Delco, Alex Woods, eventually Sergeant Tripp, and Megan Donner. Going back through the show, I couldn't help but notice that the entire first season, it's like they're throwing things at a wall and they're hoping they stick, and boy, did they throw a lot of things at the wall. Looking at the way CSI is brought up, their main two leads are Grissom and Catherine. So for CSI Miami, they wanted Horatio and Megan. Except here's the thing. Anytime these two characters got together, I mean, if you walked out of the room, you missed virtually nothing. If you look at a conversation between Grissom and Catherine, you are immediately involved with their conversation, with how they are able to tap around each other. Megan and Horatio can't even get remotely to tango with each other. And it was given a go for about 13 episodes before they gave Megan Donner the ceremonious write-off. If you were to go through the first 13 episodes of CSI Miami and skip all of Megan Donner's scenes or take her out, it would make virtually no difference in the way that the rest of the series goes, because Megan Donner is never seen from again or even mentioned again, as if she never existed. And it's no shame to the actress Kim Delaney. She gave whatever she could to this character. The way I kind of say it is, she was playing a good character on the wrong show. It's almost similar in the way that CSI had its pilot and how Holly unfortunately didn't make the cut. CSI definitely had to go through some trial runs before we got the official team to get together, but In CSI Miami's case, after 13 episodes, then things started to pick up some steam and they started to pick some of the players that were going to be staying here. But let's face it, he did not need a co-star because the real co-star is the sunglasses. But with characters like these, it seems like CSI Miami has a lot going for it. Except there's been one thing about it that has stuck out that even I can't ignore. These characters are too serious. The seriousness did have a tone before it became unserious. I say that as I actively have 7 seasons of the show on my shelf. Now, the whole point of a procedural is that you have to have serious characters, but even some procedurals knew when to take a chill pill. Going back through CSI Miami, it's almost hard to distinguish what is a one-liner and what is supposed to be the actual dialogue of the show. There are times I'll have the show on for background noise and I'm listening to Horatio make a line and it sounds so dramatic that I go, yeah! And then it's actually just the show itself. And I'm like, oh, we already did that. Okay. Like, it does make it interesting to know like what kind of dialogue Horatio Caine has, because it is one of the most interesting things about his character that has kept people coming back. But then there's the rest of the characters that also sound so matter of fact that it makes it hard to breathe with some of these characters and get anything else out of them. Like, they talk like this the entire time. In a way, CSI Miami, it's kind of like the roller coaster of the CSI franchise. It just keeps going up and down and up and down. It changed things and it brought in some different aspects that made it different than its predecessor. But this difference is not exactly known for the way it should be, and it makes CSI Miami stand out in a different way today. But the other thing that has stand out in a way that, it's gonna hurt my soul to have to say this, but what was the point of these characters? Now, the whole point of a show is you have characters that keeps you engaged and keeps you going, and riding the coattails of CSI, you have to make characters that stand out. But there's so many things that was underwhelming or underdeveloped or never developed that it makes it stick out more about wondering what was the point of these characters if their own plot points weren't being developed to develop them more. There's often a joke with underdeveloped shows that it's like porn without the plot. Now I'm like, I don't know, I think porn has more of a plot than CSI Miami does it sometimes. So I have a couple of examples, my evidence, if you will. This is also going to be a good little dry run to just get through the characters, like my favorite saying, 2 birds, 1 bird feeder, no stones. So starting with Horatio Caine, our main guy, the guy with the glasses and the one-liners. Man, he is a footnote in his own character. Horatio is a great character, and I like what he stands for. I like the hope he gives to all of the victims. You feel like life can go on once Horatio saves the day. But it almost feels like Horatio doesn't have much going on for himself, because they drop a lot of stuff from his storyline. His story in the very beginning is plagued with his brother's death that left a very heavy burden in his family, as well as the police department, as his leadership was questioned because of the pending investigation around what happened. They thought, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, but Horatio had as many questions as everyone else did about his brother's death, and he did carry the weight of his family for like the first 3 seasons. He took care of his sister-in-law, he took care of his nephew, he took care of his illegitimate niece that he later found out that his brother fathered. He was cleaning up messes left and right. But did he complain about cleaning up the messes? No. Horatio's feelings for his sister-in-law has also been another admirable quality to him, that even though his sister-in-law, Yelena Salas, who was also a detective, could handle her own, but he's like, ma'am, no way. I'ma still take care of you. It's a nice quality. Like, he knows a woman can take care of herself, but when it's a woman in his life, it's a different story. Except here's the thing, all of that gets dropped. Without question, without warning, there's no goodbye, there's no send-off. It just looks like Horatio's life just kind of fell into a cold case, and everything became his current life, not his past life, not his side life. It's a hard grasp to get anything outside of CSI. The only thing close enough was when he got into a relationship with his coworker's sister dying of cancer, and that was sweet. I don't know why they passed it for romance, because it just virtually didn't have much romance, but the guy needed something. You would think with him going on about family and what it means to him that the show kind of drops the very thing he pushes. It almost feels like the show has a double standard, that they don't stand for what they do. And the other part of his story, which I was kind of shocked they didn't do too much with, is his background as an NYPD detective. They used this as the gateway to get into CSI New York, which is pretty cool, and I did like that moment, and it did a lot for growing into CSI New York. But then they didn't use the potentiality to use with him having that background story. There's only 2 times in this show that his background as an NYPD detective was talked about. And I'm kind of surprised that with that there wasn't any more crossovers with CSI New York to learn more about what he was like in New York, but nope, the show had to move on. And then there's Callie Duquesne, who is a sweet character, but honestly, looking at her and having to explain anything, I don't get much out of her. So Callie is made to be the female face of CSI Miami because, Megan Donner didn't work out quite so well, so they just raised her up the ladder. And honestly, it's a little bit of a stretch trying to find anything about her. She's not a dislikable character, but at the same time, there's not much about her because they keep dropping stuff from her story. The only thing that sticks out about her is that she had an alcoholic father, and I say had because they also dropped that thing. And she dealt with that for a little bit, but she's such a stiff character, it's hard to get any emotion out of her for the way that she's kind of blank. Kind of funny for, just like the bullets she goes through, she herself is kind of a blank. Now, I will say this, Callie does have some badass moments where I'm like, all right, you go, girl, but like I said, if you have to treat her like a character and see her history like Horatio, there is not much going on. She's just there. But as a fun fact, the actress Emily Proctor that plays Callie Duquesne was originally a TV weather reporter before she was promoted to being a crime reporter, but she left that job because the work was, as she put it, too gory. I'm like, and then you go on to CSI Miami. That makes a lot of sense. And then there's Eric Delco, who is, I'm just gonna have to say it, he's the hottie of the show. He's the eye candy of the show, but his character is a little bit more than the eye candy. It's revealed in a flashback that Eric did not really see a future in CSI until Horatio was like, I see something, you can put the I in CSI. And that does bring a lot of him up, is because Horatio kind of builds him up. As much as these characters can be too serious, there are some tight dynamics in here, and Eric and Horatio are one of the few dynamics that work because, like I said, the real co-star was the sunglasses. Eric has had some good arcs. All of them kind of get rolled into the mess of Miami, but there's one that sticks out the most that I want to bring attention to. In season 5, when he gets shot, and it's unclear what's going to happen when he pulls through, and unfortunately, there is damage when he does. We don't get too many police officers in the line of duty about what they have to do when they have a traumatic brain injury. You don't walk away from that unscathed, and they put in Eric's character how he's had to relearn his job with this unfortunate injury that's going to make it difficult for his job. I'm sure it's been talked about in many different police forces, but it's rare when you actually see it depicted like this. These characters might appear to be unbreakable, but there are different ways that this job has broken them, and not everything is going to be emotionally. You never know what on the trauma toll you're going to get. And then there's my favorite character, Tim Speedle, and I'm just going to say it. There's absolutely nothing about his character, but he's funny. Looking at the character of Tim Speedle in the first 2 seasons of CSI Miami, I've talked about this in the show before, that he was one of my first celebrity crushes, so I have to give it some credit that I do love this character just for existing, but having to look at this character and seeing how he exists, he's just kind of there. I don't mind that he's there, it's why he's my favorite, but there wasn't much about his family or anything, because again, it just feels like you're seeing these characters on the job, but you don't know who they are outside of the job, and you don't know much of anything for Speedle outside of the job unless he's with someone from the job. Speedle just kind of interacted with everybody, and there was rarely anything said, but ironically, his ending note did kind of allude that he didn't really do too much with his life. But he still didn't think that it could ever happen to him. In the opening of the 3rd season, before he and Horatio Caine go inside, he says, "Oh, well, I got plenty of time for that," and then he just dies. What a morbid thing to have to know, that this was going to be his ending, but that's the thing, you'd never know when it's going to be the end for these characters. That gives more of a realistic thing on the job, so having someone that you were with for 2 years and then they just die, like, that does sting a little bit, and I think that gave him a little bit more of a good edge to his character and a good goodbye to his character. And then there's Speedle's replacement, Ryan Wolf. Ryan felt like a character that was much needed for the show. There's a certain type of energy that every character has and what every character brings, and whatever Ryan has, I don't know if the show would be the same without it. This was a roller coaster of a character that started out straight from patrol, got himself into CSI, and then made some bad choices, and then accidentally continued to make bad choices to still keep his job. Ryan is a character that is so delightfully anal that it makes him a trusted investigator. But I like how he himself has to point out that he's not a replacement, he's just the guy on the job. He himself had to consistently say that he's not Speedle, he's not Speedle, he's not Speedle. And as much as that can be, he does make a good point. He can't be treated like a replacement because he was never meant to be one. He was literally a patrol guy and didn't know when the job came up that it just happened to be around the time a guy died. He just knew there was an opportunity, and Horatio saw it, and Horatio gave that to him, just like he gave it to Eric. But in season 5, there's something I noticed that, it's a little bit weird how they made this come off. Ryan has a gambling addiction. Know who also had a gambling addiction? Warwick. Now, I don't know if that was meant to be part of Ryan's storyline about him having a gambling addiction, but when you have another character from another show have a gambling addiction, it almost seems like it's a strange parallel. But this is also made from the same guy who made CSI, and I guess he had the brains to just go ahead and give this to another character, even if it was similar. But he's in charge. I just call it as I see it, and he just makes it as he sees it. But there was one really weird part that Ryan does have to do with the plot holes in CSI Miami, was when he got shot. In season 4, a nail gun shoots him just centimeters around his eye, making a very traumatic head injury. But by the next episode, there is no bruising, there is no scarring, there's barely any redness, like he never got shot. And that was when people started to notice that some plot holes were developing in the show. But Ryan's character, all in all, not bad. I feel like he bonds the most with everybody than the way the other characters had a weird time bonding with each other. So he was a nice palate cleanser. And then there's Alex Woods, who is another good part of the show. I feel like the more I talk about these characters, there's like some that I'm saving for the good parts, and Alex is definitely a good part. Candy Alexander is a phenomenal actress. She played Maya Pope on Scandal. If you've seen Scandal, you know that's a cutthroat character. But I knew her as Alex Woods, so it kind of screwed with me a little bit to see soft, sweet-spoken Alex Woods just be an absolute maniacal terrorist on Scandal. Alex is like the mother of the group, but she doesn't exactly have to be a mother to everyone because everyone knows how to handle themselves, but Even everyone needs a soft spot to land, and Alex kind of became that soft spot to land at. And she's one of the few characters that actually has a family, so you actually get to know about her life, even though you never see it, but you know that it's there. And then there's my favorite character, Sergeant Frank Tripp. I know this will never happen because CSI is pretty much finished up after Vegas, but I would have killed to have Tripp and Brass in the same room, and I feel a little bit deprived that I never got that. Tripp is a character that breathes so well in this show, and I think it's because he's not as serious as the others. I could easily see someone like Tripp in a Miami-Dade office. He's kind of like the baby Brass, just taking care of everything and helping out the CSIs. Even after Tripp gets demoted, he still is treated with the same respect that Horatio gives him. But Rexlin himself has been around the game knowing all these different kind of characters. He's no stranger to what he has to play. And I dare say it, he has some of the best fucking lines. Horatio might be known for the one-liners, but Frank has the best delivery of all the lines that really makes the show breathe. It kind of feels like the same humor that you had in the original CSI. And also, as a little side joke, the fact that he bonds so well with Horatio Kane is actually kind of hilarious because in real life, Rex Lynn is with Reba McEntire, so I'm like, oh, no wonder he gets along with redheads. Now, the rest of the characters for CSI Miami, it's like the equivalent of what I said about how season 1 was just throwing things at a wall and hoping it stuck, and well, around season 7, 8, and 9, it just seemed like one big drawing board. They threw a lot of things at the wall, and some of it stuck, and some of it stuck too long, and some of it didn't stick at all. One of them was a character named Tara Price that only had about one season, actually not even a full season. She played an addicted medical examiner that was the replacement for Alex. And then after it was revealed that she had addiction issues, they didn't bother doing anything with her character, they just took it off. But realistically, there was nothing much to her character. But another character that was also created in season 8 to never stay was Jesse Cardoza. And, he exists. The show had already introduced new character after new character after new character after new character. It was just not working. Jesse just did not have anything for the show. Everyone has already had their moment. The only thing that makes anything semblance to the plot of it is that he did know Tim Speedle, but even that was a bit of a stretch. But then there's two other characters that did survive the last of CSI Miami, and that was Christian Clemenson, who played Dr. Tom Lohman. Dr. Tom was a good addition. It's the same equivalence to when DB Sweetie was introduced in the later part of CSI. Having Dr. Tom Lohman come at the latter part of CSI Miami, it's a soft blow the show needed just to get through the rest of it. He wasn't exactly Alex, but he still had a charm that kept him there just to get through the rest of the show. But then there's the next guy, the last guy, because I saved the best for last. Walter Simmons. The best thing that CSI Miami did was getting Omar Benson Miller on there, because that show needed some much needed humor. And this guy brought it. There was chemistry with all of the characters. There was someone else that was bringing a different vibe to the show because it was so fucking serious. And you bring this guy on and he actually levels out the room a little bit. Anytime Walter came on, this was the first thing I ever saw Omar Benson Miller in. I did not know him in 8 Mile yet, and I did not know him in any other material outside of CSI Miami. Anytime I see this actor in anything, I go, hey, it's Walter! As much as I really do love these characters, truly I do, it's why I keep the 7 seasons on my shelf. It is almost impossible to not notice when this show drops things for these characters. But then there was the biggest drop of them all, and that was one of the parts of the story that they were trying to push for 9 seasons. One of the other relationships this show tried to push besides Horatio Kane and his sunglasses was the romance between Eric Delco and Callie Duquesne. And this was pushed so much that it just became the known thing that they were going to be endgame. Except here's the thing. There wasn't an endgame to the endgame. There was an on again, off again thing between Callie and Eric. They kept going on, but going back through the show, it just wasn't very developed. I look at Sarah and Grissom and their relationship, despite it being a slow burn for 7 seasons, but I knew it was there. With this one, it's dropped so much to the point that you just kind of forget that they were trying for it. It's a lot of time before you ever get to visit this subplot again. And when it does finally happen to bring Eric and Callie together, it's like, oh, we're finally here. And then the show didn't even finish with that. So I actually had to look up if they ever ended the show with Eric and Callie still staying together. And they weren't. There wasn't even a breakup. There wasn't even any explanation. It was completely unresolved. The last thing that was known about their relationship was that Eric was going to adopt a child, and him and Callie were discussing it, but after that, there was no follow-up. They just became coworkers, and we didn't even get to see them break up or have a quieter relationship. Nothing. It was just completely cut off. There was shipping that was still trying to keep going for this couple. Like, I feel the people who shipped the show did a better job than the show itself. Now, you can't have a show without drama. I don't know about the romance, though, but, drama seemed to exist off of the set more than on the set. And one of those is a very strange story I'm about to tell you regarding one of the episodes that unfortunately derives from a real-life case that they put into the show. When I was prepping for the CSI episode, I remembered I read a piece of trivia about the episode Dark Room from season 5. And man, this piece of trivia aged like cheese. Like, I can hold a torch to most of the episodes and even some of the other weirder ones, but this one, I don't hold a torch for it. In Dark Room, the CSI team is racing against time to catch a killer that has been ensnaring young girls under the guise of being a photographer. And unfortunately, the almost victim is Natalia Boavist's sister. Now, in real life, this happened to Eva LaRue's sister. So that connection immediately is a little bit weird. And then CSI Miami gets a hold of that and goes, well, let's turn that into an episode. But here's the sickest part, my dudes, dudettes, and my non-binary babes. The show asked Eva LaRue's sister if she wanted to play a fictionalized version of herself as the almost fifth victim. So, in so many words, they wanted her to reenact her trauma. That's not cool. My friend's jaws dropped, having to put together the pieces of how messed up that is. I do not know if Eva LaRue was for this idea or if she was against the idea. We now live in a day and age where you don't tiptoe on someone's trauma, and to know that CSI Miami cash grabbed on trauma, it's real awful. It's real awful. It's one of the few real life cases that the show has taken, and to think that it's actually from one of their own and they do it in such a messed up way that's not even unique. It just feels a bit disrespectful, and I have absolutely no love for that episode now. But I did read, though, that the sister did show up in the episode. In the scene where Natalia is making the public statement about her missing sister, her sister can be seen in the corner of the crowd. At least she wanted to be a part of it, but in a way that wasn't going to cause attention. She's like, just put me in the crowd and that's it. And that's a good call. But besides the real-life trauma drama, there was some other drama going on. And that drama's name is David Caruso. For someone who is a seriously dramatic actor, he is also a seriously dramatic person. And oh Lord, do I have a story to share with you. about why Rob Zombie hates David Caruso. Rob Zombie came on to an episode called LA, which, one, I find to be hilarious considering that CSI Miami is actually filmed in Los Angeles for 90% of the time, so what an accurate name by accident. But Rob Zombie was the first time I'd ever seen an episode highlighted before it came out in this big show of like premiere, like, oh, next episode, Rob Zombie directs. I knew he was a musician, but I did not know him yet as a director. This is a story that's not really well known, but it makes sense knowing the history of David Caruso. This drama dates all the way back to NYPD Blue, and unfortunately, Rob Zombie got a taste of that himself. It took hours to get David Caruso to come down for a scene or agree or to do virtually anything, still proving how he was one of the most difficult actors to work with. And Rob Zombie definitely got that taste of what it was like. Rob Zombie's films have a bit of a reputation for not being the best, but I feel like he deserves at least an award for surviving David Caruso's drama. And it's not a bad episode. It's actually one of the good parts near the ending when the show was drying up a little bit more. Just like I mentioned with Grave Danger and how Tarantino put his Tarantino spots on it. Rob Zombie did his spots on the show with having Sherry Moon Zombie and Malcolm McDowell and getting Michael Madsen. It was a pretty star-studded episode that hadn't happened for quite some time. But unfortunately, around CSI Miami's 10th season, it had moved from Monday night to Sunday night. And that might not mean a lot today, but back then, that basically spelled death to a slow burn cancellation. It was the show that came on right after football. This was something considered to be primetime television, and it had been reduced to nothing but just a fill-in before the news on CBS. That's a pretty slow burny way to go out. It was still so popular that CSI Miami would eventually go on to a real-life documentary show called The Real CSI Miami, and it's not bad. I gave it a watch. It was a cool little documentary series that covered cases from 10, 15 years ago and brought in crime scene investigators to discuss how they solve these cases, like the characters on CSI Miami discussed it. It sort of married the way that the profession in fiction and the profession in reality. It's not exactly a follow-up, but it's not exactly unrelated because people remember the crimes in Miami from CSI Miami. So it does make sense to have a little follow-up documentary that gets to highlight more about what people kept in the intrigue all these years was getting to see how crimes were solved. And after CSI Miami ended, well, that was the last time you ever heard about David Caruso. He immediately retired after CSI Miami canceled, and after a 35-plus year career, I don't see why not. Man's made a lot of money off of CSI Miami and NYPD, and the time he got smacked in the face by Sylvester Stallone on First Blood. I'm sure he's living a pretty low-key life, even though he was a high-key man. So with the 10 years this show was on the air and the 14 years this show went off the air, yeah, I can see why people still like this show. I mean, despite my complaints, I still like it. CSI Miami has pros that are cons, and its cons are the pros. And it just takes turns on which is a con and which is a pro, which is not a bad deal in my opinion. There's still good things about this show that outweighs the weird parts about this show. I like that we had a leader like Horatio Caine that came through to save the day. Even if it felt ridiculous at times, the day was still saved. He heard out these victims on the worst day of their life and became that beacon of hope for them. Horatio's a fictional character, but he feels like a real hero. He is strong as he is supportive, and, the rest of the characters had their moments too, when they also saved the day for other people and got to be heroes for others. The heroism in this show is still very strong. And then there's the third CSI show that had 11 seasons, and almost no one knows its existence. No one knows what CSI New York is. Yet, it seems kind of self-explanatory. It's just investigators, but you're just seeing them in New York. So what does CSI New York have to offer that makes it different than Vegas and Miami? Honestly, nothing. And that's what makes it great. It wasn't trying to be more or less than its predecessors because it is literally a sequel of a sequel. All the checkpoints for a good show, especially a good CSI show, has to have a leader, a team, and some compelling cases. And if that hits the check marks, then there's nothing wrong with it. But it's still hidden in the grapevines of television. And I think that might be because of its timing. Having CSI being the new wave of TV and then having CSI Miami come in to be a sequel that is more stylish, all CSI New York had to offer was just hitting those checkpoints. And it's hard to fault something that doesn't have a fault, but it just unfortunately had rotten timing that people were already introduced to all these shows that you were either going to be into it or you weren't. Around season 2 in CSI Miami, similar to what happened in regular CSI, CSI New York begins in the Sunshine State when Horatio Caine gets a case of a brutal double murder. And because Horatio has a promise that can pretty much go over any legal jurisdiction, he is going to go find the killer that went all the way to New York. So after Horatio came in and showed us the CSI New York team, now it was time to actually be involved with the CSI New York team. And their first episode, holy shit, I'm just going to say it. I don't think I've ever seen another show that honored New York quite like CSI New York. Between 2001 and 2003, it was a trying time about how to go forward in the media now that 9/11 happened. Talking about 9/11 in the media has been like a mixed bag. There have been some shows that unfortunately did not know that 9/11 was going to happen and had a plot line around that. And then there were some that anything that had to do with a plane going into a building was, immediately gone. There were TV shows based in New York that had to take elements of New York out. Even Law and Order Special Victims Unit, the most famous show based in New York, had to pull the opening because you could see the Twin Towers in the background. There's no way to not talk about the most horrific attack in the nation's history. But they did this by taking us through the wake after the tragedy, to where things are at that point. 3 years to see that the hurt is still there despite still going strong. The first episode of CSI New York has a regular case like any other day, but it's the ending of the episode that talks about 9/11 without having to go into too much detail about 9/11. Mac Taylor's monologue about his wife is one of the most powerful, tragic monologues I've ever heard in CSI history. And I've had my heart broken by many of these characters, but because this is talking about how a fictional character is affected by a real life event, but all those real life events is pouring into this fictional character to explain the wake and the weight of that wake, it hits on a level. If you haven't seen CSI New York, I would highly recommend getting to see at least the end of the first episode with the beach ball monologue. It's a scene that honors the tragedy while also honoring the ones that lost a loved one and what they had to do to move on. It's a heavy, hurtful thing that happened to the nation, and Mac Taylor felt like a representation of those that had been hurt by 9/11. The way that I would sum up that scene, it feels like the whole episode was giving New York one big, giant hug. From the tragedy, from the loss, and everyone that had been affected in their own way, Mac Taylor did a service to those that are still hurting from that loss. It's not every day that there is a sequel of a sequel show that honors tragedy like that. I think now's as time as any to talk about the cast of CSI New York, because there's nothing wrong with them, and I feel like they just need a little spotlight anyway. First on the list is the first guy that is our CSI guy. Starting off the list is our first CSI guy, my favorite man, my Lieutenant Dan, Mac Taylor. So, fun fact, I was today years old when I found out how they put together Mac Taylor's name. Mac comes from the character's father, but Taylor is derived straight from Gary Sinise's favorite and most prominent role as Lieutenant Dan Taylor. I can't tell you how stupid I felt not putting that connection together. I was waiting to hear the Curb Your Enthusiasm ending theme after I found out that information. It could have been so easy to make Mac Taylor just like any other procedural law enforcement leader, but no. They made Mac Taylor stick out the way Grissom stuck out, or the way Horatio stuck out, but he wasn't like Grissom, and he wasn't like Horatio. I had just mentioned that his introduction to the show was him grieving the death of his wife, and you do go on a journey with this character, getting over the grief. Whereas CSI Miami lost their own plots about family, CSI New York did not lose their own plots about the family. It is a reoccurring thing in every single season to see Mac Taylor through his grief. And another thing to love about his character is that he has such a beautiful individual relationship with every single one of the crew. With Stella, Danny, Sid the coroner, Peyton the other coroner that he had a relationship with for a hot second. So we got to see Mac be happy for what's goodness gracious. But out of all the leaders on CSI, I felt Mac's journey more than the others. With Grissom, he felt like a puzzle that you got to put together, but it was fun putting the puzzle together. With Horatio, you had fun with the one-liners. With Mac, you really got to go through a process of him holding on to Claire a little bit more. There's a wonderful arc he has in the show when he finds out that his wife had a child before they got married, before she even met Mac. And when he finds out that there's a son, he is very quick to share his memories with Claire's son. It is one of the most giving characters I've ever seen in CSI. There's never going to be another Mac Taylor like Mac Taylor. And with someone like Mac Taylor, you would need another strong leading lady. Whoever is responsible for creating Stella Bonacera, if they ever need a liver or an alibi or help with another show, I will gladly give my service, because this is such a great female character. If there's one thing CSI has, they have great female characters, and I'm glad that Stella is a part of that mix. Stella is like the Greek goddess of CSI New York. She's inquisitive. She spots clues in the most unique ways, in the same way that Sherlock Holmes would. And most of anything, I love how she speaks up for the victim in her own way. Very early on in season 1, there is a woman who is SA'd in the park. And she's the daughter of someone very famous, and she has to tell this victim's father about what happened, and the father was quick to say, oh, well, I should have raised her better, gave her all these brothers, I thought she was tougher than that, and Stella goes, no, she is tough. She fought tooth and nail, sir. Give her more credit. Before I even knew what CSI New York was, there's an episode of hers that I saw that stuck with me in my childhood and became a raw, prime example about what it means to survive. In season 2, episode 21, Mac and the gang get the phone call that no one wants to get. That there's been an officer-involved shooting, and unfortunately, it's at Stella's place. When Stella is found, she goes through the entire regime that has to happen of collecting what's underneath her fingernails and having to collect swabs. And all the while, her friends, all the other investigators, are not treating her like a victim, and they treat her like a friend that has been through a traumatic ordeal, but she herself still treats it like a case because this still is imperative to know for the justice. She cooperates all the way to find out what happens. And when it's found out about what Stella had to do to survive, it stings in a certain way because it had to happen. When you're in a case, whether it's literally life or death, you use whatever is around you to help ensure your survival. It's not pretty. Survival is not a cut and dry thing. You don't know what your survival is going to look like. But it's how she picked herself up afterwards. She goes back to her apartment and cleans everything up, knowing that it's not going to erase or unring the bell about what happened to her, that there has to be a tomorrow. What happened to her is not going to go away quietly, and it still happened. Stella is truly one of the strongest characters on this show, and that episode is my evidence for all of it. Now, Stella was only on until 2010. She exited around season 7, and honestly, when I found that out, that's where I didn't even want to finish watching it. That was my version of there is no CSI without Grissom, there was no CSI New York without Stella. I stand for Stella. She is my girl. So another character to talk about is actually hilarious because the actor who plays him, it ain't his first rodeo on CSI. Danny Messer is a character that beats to the heart of New York. It could have been easy to make Danny Messer just another CSI stock character that could fit the build of Nick or Eric, but I'm glad that he doesn't feel like a knockoff of other CSI shows and is still a unique character just like the rest of them. I like that Danny is a character that doesn't have to prove himself. He doesn't get himself in situations way over his head, but whenever there is something that comes through that is way beyond what he can do, he's very quick to know how to handle anything that comes his way. Whether it's crime labs taken over by terrorists, or CSIs being framed, or having to do the roughest part of the job, Danny is not hesitant to do what he can for a part of the protocol. His morale and his protocol go hand in hand. But also, here's the hilarious thing. Carmen Giovanlizio, oh my god, I just botched that so hard, that was horrifying. Carmine Giannivoso, oh, this is horrible. He guest starred on CSI in early season 3, playing a character named Thumpy G, or as Catherine called him, Thumper. And then he popped up on CSI Miami, of course, playing Danny Messer, and that's how he landed on CSI New York, but it makes me wonder when they had to do the crossovers, if they had to, reminisce about the past when he was Thumpy G before he was Danny Messer. So Sheldon Hawkes is the next character to talk about, who is the coroner that would eventually go on to be a CSI himself. So it was nice to have a show that was still taking people from different departments and then exploring how they want to be a CSI, and that they give Sheldon a good run for it. When Sheldon became a CSI, there was some initial skepticism because he had just jumped from being a coroner and then being in the field. And Mac Taylor was quick to dismiss all of those doubts and say, I trust Sheldon. One of my favorite moments is when he says that Jennifer Lopez helped him solve a case. So I wish I could remember what episode it was. I swear I'm more prepared than this. Something in the music video gives him the answer that he needs because, like Grissom said, the clues are everywhere. This clue just happened to be in a freaking Jennifer Lopez music video. And when he tells Mac that he has the answer, he said, if it wasn't for J-Lo. And Mac Taylor is like, come again? And on top of that, years later, Hill Harper would eventually go on to work with Jennifer Lopez in the movie The Boy Next Door. So J-Lo did solve the case, and eventually he got to work with J-Lo. Which I imagine today is not much of anything. Now for this next character, you could be blindfolded and know that Don Flack is a New York character. Don Flack is probably one of the most like New Yorkiest cops I have ever seen, and oh my god, it kind of builds the show a little bit more. Like how Brass really makes Las Vegas, Flack makes CSI New York feel like CSI New York. I really believe he is out here getting things done. There is so much history, there's so much of the state that I see within Don Flack and really marries well with the show. And next is a precious baby named Lindsay Monroe, who is nicknamed Montana. Lindsay looks like a small town girl, and she sounds like a small town girl. But that small town girl knows how to keep a crew together and solve a case. Anytime Lindsay talks, I feel the weight of the work that she had to put in to go all the way from Montana and get to where she is in New York. And her relationship with Danny is probably the most successful relationship in CSI behind Grissom and Sarah. You know, unlike another show that spent 9 seasons trying to build up a couple and never went through it, at least Danny and Lindsay went to it. Got married and had a baby. Well, not in that order, but it was such a joy getting to see her grow on the show. This next guy would later on be known for being a ghost facer, but here I know him as Adam Ross. Adam is kind of like almost a clone of Greg Sanders. And that's not a bad thing. You gotta have a cute geek in there. As much as CSI can kind of have some strange parallels in places, as I talked about, this is a parallel that I don't mind. And then last on my list is Sid Hammerback, Sid was a here and there character before they finally made him a permanent character, and gosh, it's a good thing that they did. Sid is like a palate cleanser character. He's just funny enough, and he's just quirky enough. He's just sweet enough. This was a character that did not need any more than just that, because there's already a lot of pawns on the chessboard with many characters that we get involved with. And again, after 3 shows now with CSI, it could be very easy to overdo a character, and I'm glad they didn't overdo Sid. And then I found out that the actor that plays him, Robert Joy, is gay in real life and has been a super advocate for many different causes. So that just made me love his character even more. Also, this was one of the earliest works of Vanessa Furlado, which is a name that many people probably won't know, but she's also been in so many movies like Grindhouse and more recently the miniseries Griselda. And I have loved her for many years, and getting to see her on Griselda just brought me right back to seeing her on CSI New York. And God, man, the woman is beautiful. I absolutely didn't need to add that, but I absolutely had to add that. So when I got into CSI New York, it felt like it was just kind of following a lot of paint by numbers and doing similar cases to CSI and CSI Miami. But there's one thing that CSI New York did that doesn't really get enough credit that I got to witness in its own history when it aired. Back in 2009, CBS had to make a warning in advance that the next episode of CSI New York would be about the Holocaust. They spared absolutely no spoilers. They were like, this is going to be some heavy stuff. And when the episode came on, it was a heavy advisory warning. And my 13-year-old ass was like, bring it on. And being 13 years old, I told my mom. My mom was like, you're on your own, kid. And I'm like, okay, well, I warned you. I had never seen a show before make that level of a warning beforehand, considering we live in a day and age where we like to be warned of triggering material, which maybe this is a good time as ever that I should also do my own trigger warning, since that's the episode that I'm going to be leading in to talk about is Yaseret. There's only a few moments I can say when I watch an episode that's ingrained in my brain forever. I have a level of respect for how they depicted this episode to warn beforehand of a week in advance and prepare it by saying This is the episode dealing with the Holocaust. But the way that they depicted something that's not easy to talk about was with so much respect and integrity and some damn good shock. Now, I'm not going to give away the ending because that itself is an experience, a wholesome experience to have, but I can tell you the plot of the episode. The plot of Yaseret follows a murder that leads the CSI team to a group of white supremacists that have stolen precious items from Holocaust survivors, and they're like, not in my state. And as they're going through all the items, they find out that there's still a Nazi guard out there. And Mac and the gang, they gotta find them. The episode is a roller coaster of intensity. When the items... This was a dark episode that was given so much grace. There's an amalgamation of stuff to learn that I felt like I got out of this than most of the history books. Even though CSI itself is known for its inaccuracies of science, there's no way you can be inaccurate with history here. And just like the 9/11 opening to the whole show, of course there's going to be a grace and care to talk about the Holocaust. It's not an easy topic to get into. With the warnings that was given about this episode, it leads with the education and honor of this episode. Now, I don't know if my listeners know this, and this is something I learned, is that this episode aired on April 29th, 2009, the 64th anniversary of the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp on April 29th, 1945. This show planned it in advance to land on a memorial episode from a Memorial Day. Wow. And the episode title Yaseret refers to the Hebrew practicing of memorializing a loved one. And that is all I can say before I can go any further. Please, if you're able to, if you find it on streaming, Yaseret is a great episode. You don't get too many honorable history episodes every dynasty. So there was a question that I was asked completely unrelated to this episode until it became related to this episode. What happened to Edward Furlong? Well, he played a serial killer on here. Again, with CSI New York being a show kind of lost in the twilight zones of TV, it is very bizarre to have to say that there is proof that Edward Furlong has been doing something, and it's in this show. I don't know if anyone has really followed Edward Furlong, but John Connor's been through some shit. A lot of shit. Some of it was shit he started. And his acting career just hasn't been the same since T2 and American History X. Edward Furlong played the serial killer Shane Casey, which was kind of like the main arc, essentially, of CSI New York. Shane Casey pops in like Pee Wee Herman pops in, and it's not good, but it's entertaining. Near the end of season 7, when Lindsay and Danny's baby is unfortunately held captive by him, it's not as shocking as it would be. It's more like, oh, hey, Shane, been a while. Like, that's the reaction that I get when I see him, mostly because it's Edward Furlong playing a serial killer, and because they've done his script with the kind of yo-yoing that the Joker would have done, it has a weird taste to it. But it exists. At least Edward Furlong had a job, and CSI New York said yes to him. Good for him. I wouldn't say it's a villain for the books because it's CSI New York. We're at the youngest child of Anthony Zuiker's TV baby. We're not going to be getting a lot of gold, but man, he gave some copper. But in terms of the rest of the plot with its arcs, they were fairly strong. There were some reoccurring villains. There were some reoccurring elements. I have to say that the whole thing with Mac Taylor and his wife's other son, I think it handled it better than the way Horatio Caine did in that whole son arc. And it did do a good job presenting the characters and treating them the way that we have treated the other CSI characters or the Miami characters, that we stay with these people and we want to see what their end looks like. And it's a fairly decent run. I skimmed through the rest of the show just to see what happened post-Stella. After Stella Bonacera's departure, Stella Ward came on and finished out the rest of the seasons, and they were just there. But the ending to CSI New York, it didn't end on a good ending, but it ended on a good note. We started out CSI New York with a grieving Mac Taylor and a crime unit that was building itself together with relationships and intelligence and cases. There were some hits and misses along the way. There was people departed that we didn't want to depart with. And we want whoever's left to at least know that they're going to be okay. And it's nice to know that Mac's going to be okay. Stella is somewhere out there and she's okay. Danny and Lindsay have a family now. Sheldon's doing great. Sid is amazing. If you never see these characters again, you know that these characters are good. In every installment of CSI, there's been some way that the show itself has mentioned a real life event or a hobby or a profession or something that isn't normally talked about. And one of them was cosplay. Well, it was referenced, but it still existed. Now, cosplay was on the uprising back in the early 2000s. I would know. I was there. But cosplay was not something to be talked about in mainstream media yet. It just existed in its own bubble. The most cosplay was ever talked about was YouTube and didn't cross into other shows unless it was a topic. And CSI New York just happened to pick cosplay as a topic to be talked about. In Season 4, Episode 5, Mac and the team find a murder victim that bears a striking resemblance to an avatar from an online game known as Second Life. So Mac goes undercover in the world of RPG to find the killer. Mac Taylor had asked, well, what was the point of the victim dressed up from the game? And the beautiful geek Adam Ross goes on to explain that it's called cosplay, and it derives from costume play. It's a brief moment because that's literally all the explanation to cosplay is costume play. But being in a time like the 2000s when cosplay was not mentioned, and if it wasn't respected like it is today, it was a big moment. I got to go to conventions and proudly tell people that CSI New York referenced cosplay in a respectful way. It's like a flashback to the furry episode in CSI because Anthony E. Zwicker's son was a furry, and that was talked about because of his son. And I don't know where in the world cosplay came through or how they got that, but damn, I'm glad they did that. So for my final little ending about this show, I feel like there's nothing more to say than I've already said, but I do have a very unique piece of trivia that the show is being kept alive through a Pluto commercial. Recently, when Pluto TV was doing its advertising and had certain people on there, one of them was Gary Sinise, dressed up as a potato on a couch, and I think you can get the joke that's being formed here. And all he mentions is his own work, because of course he's going to mention his own work, and one of the last things was, watch CSI New York on Pluto TV. It's like, at least Gary Sinise is keeping the show alive all these years. So, with 3 shows, what's going on right now? How come 3 powerful shows with its own pros and cons has a hard time staying relevant? Well, I think it's because of the CSI effect. If you go online and type in the CSI effect, you can find a multitude upon multitude upon multitude of different cases that has been challenged from the CSI effect, whether it was real life cases or pointing at individual episodes and finding out that the forensics are not accurate. Anthony E. Zwicker stated that the science is accurate when it's not. And that makes a big problem in all 3 shows that has shown the public that this is how it works. This is how cases are solved. This is how forensics are found out. This is how law procedures work. So a public eating that up is going to take that for its truth. So in real life legal cases, people would often fight to say, well, how come my case isn't treated like CSI? And naturally, that makes a judge look at a plaintiff and go, "Are you kidding me? You're going to compare your case to a fictional show, but this fictional show has supposedly said it's all accurate and this is how things work. This is how people were learning about the process and took CSI for educational purposes." So if a public is eating that up and taking it as the truth and then finding out that the forensic is false, then that means the CSI shows are hypocrites. It's not a pretty thing, but it is true. After CSI came out, the shows were under a tighter microscope and individually criticized. If you go on IMDb, you will find out how someone has proved the forensic is inaccurate. But another point made about its inaccuracies is the fact that every episode seemed to solve a case within that day. I mean, there's been most times that it wasn't solved within an episode. Sometimes it had to be solved in 2 episodes or a continuing episode seasons from now. But in reality, when it comes to a case, you never know what's going to happen. If a case is going to have fast evidence or not fast evidence, because life is unpredictable and you don't know what clues are going to be there at the time or if clues come up later on in life. And it's taught a public that cases are solved so fast you never even see the characters change clothes. But that is the magic of television, that it can make you believe anything. And I definitely believe that, because one time there was an episode on CSI Miami that had to do with the extra Y chromosome, aka the serial killer gene, and my dumbass believed it was a real thing for 7 years. So for a show called CSI, its story stands out, but its forensics seem as fictional as its characters. But it still presented the idea, and this is where I kind of have to save the shows now. The whole point about a mystery is that you're unsatisfied with the outcome and want a better one because the truth is out there. Grissom always said, the clues are out there. These are characters that taught us not to be satisfied with an answer and go out and find our own. I was unsatisfied with the answers that I got about CSI, as everyone else did, and sought out their own answers. And that is technically the whole point of CSI, isn't it? Is to find your own answers. Oh, good job, CSI. You made wrong answers for us to find the real ones to make us do some work. Thank you, my head hurts. Now, just because CSI isn't accurate doesn't mean that it should be disregarded, that it started the idea to pique the interest of science. There are so many other parody shows out there and so many documentaries out there that exist because there was something that brought that to the attention. We had a man from Las Vegas who was literally just working for $8 an hour that had a great idea about showing what a crime lab looks like, and here we are. And yeah, the forensics have to be taken with a grain of salt, but it's the idea that sparked it to get into forensics. I wouldn't have gotten the idea to get answers for myself if CSI didn't do it first. And I also mentioned that this is a show that I do have to credit that got me through 7th and 8th grade history and science. And I don't regret that that is how I learned about some legal terms like wet foot, dry foot, or learning about what viscosity, or learning the real name for barbiturates. And I would have known all that if it wasn't for the CSI franchise. I do love, though, that in the end of CSI, they did kind of go back to the basics and make like a big full circle moment as to the relevancy of how CSI was starting to be looked at for inaccurate, and actually titled an episode called The CSI Effect. It's kind of a funny full circle moment, and I feel like that's the best way to kind of bring it up to this ending point here. So I'm going to end this episode with 3 things that Gil Grissom, Horatio Caine, and Mac Taylor have taught all these years. There are clues everywhere. Trust but verify, and that there is hope after tragedy. So usually I go into my big spiel about my final notes and all, but I'm not done talking about CSI yet. There are many more things in my notes that I have collected that wouldn't really get another opportunity until now. So, next week, I am providing a bonus episode called My Top 10 CSI Episodes. It will be my first ever top 10 list on the Screen Queen, which, it's about time. So that will be our final episode before we start birthday month, aka my last month of my 20s before I go in there. Well, at least watching CSI was a good send off. So thank you to those out there that have had to endure 2 hours of me gushing and bushing about 3 shows that have a really interesting way to exist today. This was a daunting episode, but I really enjoyed getting to take a big piece of my media history and pouring it in here. I had a lot of fun. But until the next episode, you can catch up with me on my Instagram at the Queen of the Screen. And you can also find me on YouTube. Just look for the girl with the glasses. My big round glasses. You can't miss me. And I always like to advertise my book series, Inglorious Inc., which you can find on Amazon. And I have that bad boy listed in the description box. Alrighty. You all take care now. Stay amazing. Don't get fooled again. This is your Screen Queen, signing off. Bye-bye!